This is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Faulk. Thanks for joining us. What has long been theoretical may be well on its way to becoming a reality this week. After a surge of local coronavirus infections has county public health officials advising caution and vigilance. So far in this pandemic, Humboldt County's isolation has worked to our benefit. The redwood wall that surrounds our collection of settlements by the sea has functioned as a kind of moat against the coronavirus, helping us to maintain some of the lowest disease levels in the state. Whereas much of California and the nation have been subjected to a series of infection spikes, at times pushing their healthcare systems to the brink, we here in Humboldt County have had relatively smooth sailing. There are signs this week that our good luck may be coming to an end. On Wednesday and Thursday together, we logged a frightening 29 new cases, a high number that joins an already spiking number of local hospitalizations. Today, that number was back down to 5, luckily. All this comes, of course, as a close-fought election comes to an end. Initially advertised as a watershed moment for the body politic, many hoped the electoral process would flush away at least some of the division and rancor we've been living through. The voting itself went extraordinarily well, especially considering the challenges brought on by COVID. Yet even with that success, our country finds itself once again struggling against the stress and anxiety that's wafted our way like a mushroom cloud from Washington, D.C. Disease meet division. This ride, however scary, is far from over. Since the voting stopped, I've been itching to sit down with Representative Jared Huffman, our Democratic congressman from Marin County, to talk about where he sees the country going in the near term, given the results of the election and the resistance to those results put up by just under half of the country. I've also wondered about the fate of the long-promised second installment of federal COVID aid, which, given the current circumstances, may well be all that remains between many local businesses and insolvency. I sat down with Huffman today and asked him about those issues, hoping to get some perspective on what exactly Congress and the new presidential administration have planned to address COVID-19.
Well, the short term, unfortunately, is going to be up to those of us in Congress and the current administration during this lame duck session. But thankfully, it's also going to be up to states and local government leaders around the country who almost by default have had to step in and lead in the absence of a national strategy. So, look, my advice to everyone on this is continue to listen to the people that know what they're talking about. There's so many voices that are ill-informed, counterproductive, divisive. This really is a moment that calls for listening to public health experts and good, sound science to get us through.
Yeah. Do you support, people have been talking about the possibility of a national lockdown, maybe a state or regional lockdown, and a mask mandate. Would you support those things if Biden?
I don't think anyone is seriously talking about a national lockdown. I think our response has to be more granular and focused on hotspots and areas of breakout. So I think we're just going to have to look to states and local governments to lead on that. There's not going to be a national lockdown. What I think there is going to be starting January 21st is a much more coherent national message on things like wearing masks and taking basic precautions to protect yourself and those around you. And very soon thereafter, if we can't get it done in this lame duck session, a national strategy that actually utilizes things like the Defense Production Act to make sure that we have the testing materials that we need to really get out ahead of this, to make sure that we have all of the medical equipment and supplies that are going to start to run short again. When you look at the numbers, including in Humboldt County, where we're having a spike right now.
We are having a spike.
We are not out of the woods on things like the PPE shortages that we've dealt with over the last 7 or 8 months. So all of that needs to be addressed in the fastest possible time frame.
Now, an interesting point that some people have been making is that with the accelerating cases and the economic ramifications that that's having across the country, that maybe it would be better if the House went ahead and budged on its sort of HEROES Act offer to the Senate, where maybe do a more targeted, limited stimulus, just so that there is a stimulus, and that businesses that are at the end of the rope would have some option for help, even if it's not the ideal package that you guys have been advocating for.
I think the gridlock and the lack of productivity in Washington is frustrating for everyone. I'm at the front of the list of frustration on it myself. But look, here's what's important. You got to ask yourself, what do we need to do here? Not just do we want a deal that may or may not even help people, may or may not even make any of this better. And that's where this becomes a much more difficult equation. My Democratic colleagues and I have identified what we think are the critical elements that need to be in there. It includes supplemental unemployment insurance benefits to help get regular people, not big corporations, not Jeff Bezos, not the folks that are doing just fine, but the people that have been thrown out of work because of this pandemic. They need a lifeline so that they can pay their rent and their mortgage, and we can avoid further economic fallout. That's super important. And we're just at loggerheads over whether to do that and how generous to be with those benefits. Nutrition. Humboldt County's food banks are seeing demand unlike any other time. And that's going on right now around California, around this country. Critical pandemic nutrition benefits are expiring. And that's happening at the worst possible time. So we've got to include that. State and local governments are on the verge of laying off millions of people around this country. Those are the people we need to work in our healthcare system, to work in our schools, to make them safe so that we can reopen the economy. So all of that is just essential in a meaningful COVID response package that actually does something and doesn't just check a box so that we can play politics with this.
Yeah. After the election, Democrats have a pretty significantly smaller majority now in the House. There's been, the rash of Democrats in disarray headlines, of course, and people talking about the perceived split between moderates and progressives. Do you think that split is real? And what do you make of it?
Yeah, so look, it's real in the sense that any caucus, any group of people, any family would be having the same kind of introspective conversation that we're having right now because we didn't meet our expectations and we won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory because our majority is going to be smaller. So it is very natural that we would be taking a good hard look, trying to understand why we didn't win where we thought we should have won. And there's going to be some scapegoating and some blaming that goes along with that, but you've got to be able to talk it through and work it through. And I am one who believes that if we can just do that, the differences within our caucus are not great. They're being amplified right now by folks that would love to build a narrative of dysfunction within the Democratic Party and the Democratic caucus. That's the Republicans that are doing a lot of that. And of course, not yourself and not KEET TV, of course, but there are some folks in the media, that, always love a narrative of division and infighting. It just sells well. It's always a good story. So we're working against those points of resistance in trying to have a family conversation, but I think we can get there.
An interesting point to me that was made, there were some people who were saying that the sloganeering around, say, defund the police, that was problematic for folks. The Democrats are usually accused of having way too much nuance in their message, and that they need to get to, sort of the 5 words or less, really punchy salesmanship. Do you think that things like defund the police, which was obviously an oversimplified, announcement as to what the Democratic positioning is, do you think that hurt the Democratic Party?
Well, it was certainly used against the Democratic Party. But I think it's important to recognize that was never a Democratic message. That was never, there's not a congressional candidate in America that campaigned on that message. You could find, if you looked really hard, you could find 2 or 3 Democratic members of Congress who may have said sympathetic things about that term. Most of us said that's the wrong term to use. We totally support the fight for police reform and for racial justice, but defund the police is not what we're trying to do here. We'll reconsider our funding priorities. We'll look at greater investment in some of these frontline communities that have been systematically underserved, but you're always going to need police, and this is not, a time to defund police. Yeah. No matter how many times we said it, our Republican adversaries tried to hang that term on us. And so it just became politics. And look, here's the thing. There were people of color, communities of color in the streets for really important and good reasons all summer and fall. And if some of those activists in their passion use that slogan, it doesn't make them bad. It doesn't make them wrong. I consider myself their allies. But I'm going to try to be a little more strategic in the language and the messaging that I use. And to my knowledge, every one of my Democratic colleagues in Congress did the same thing, including members of the Black Caucus. They just didn't embrace that term, but it was used against our frontline members in the most disingenuous and frankly effective way.
You know, there was a Virginia representative who immediately after the election who had said that we need to never use that term and we need to never use the term socialism again. Do you think that
was Abigail Spanberger?
Yeah, yes, exactly.
She was fresh off a campaign that was very close, and
in a
she
Trump
felt
district,
burned.
what had been a Trump district. Yeah,
exactly. She felt burned by the way that was used against her. But you know what needed to happen in that conversation was someone needed to remind Abigail that none of us use that term.
Yeah.
It wasn't us. It was, you know, some well-meaning activists and then some Republicans in a very politically calculated way tried to misrepresent that as a Democratic talking point. So, look, we can work through these conversations as a caucus and I think come back together. But again, our Republican opponents want us to fight with each other, and the media does kind of like this division narrative.
Of course, Democrats in disarray. I went into this election, like I mentioned before we started, anxious for a resolution to the national drama of who's going to be the next president and then all of the associated baggage that's gone in with the Trump administration and all of that. And it seems as if it's almost just gotten worse because Trump has once again refused to play along and is now saying that he may or may not concede as if it's up to him. But there are real world implications for this, whereas if Biden or his team don't get the right briefings or the right support in the transition, it may have a real world impact on how he handles things moving forward. Is there anything that the Congress can do moving forward to force the president's hand, or is this pretty much just a game that he can play until he gets tired of it?
You know, there are some things that Congress can do. Whether we'll be joined by our Republican colleagues, I think remains to be seen. The big one, of course, is that on December 11th, the temporary agreement that's funding the government expires. And so, you know, as always, we can look to put some policy levers into the government funding deal that comes at that time. If one comes, we don't know if Trump will want to just sort of burn everything down on his way out. But I guess I will respectfully disagree with one part of your question that suggests that it is sort of scarier now and more fraught now. I don't think so. I actually was much more worried, you know, 3-6 months ago when I believed Trump might well be able to prevent this election from being finalized and going forward, when he might be able to delay the election somehow, and when some aspects of our defense and our law enforcement and other institutions might go along with him. That didn't happen. And I think we're just in a much better world today, having conducted an election that even President Trump's own justice and intelligence officials are acknowledging was the cleanest and you know, most protected in recent history. So these results are final, and he's going to have to accept them. And I think the theater that is playing out right now is something I would much rather deal with than the very real threats that I was worried about a few months ago.
I guess the only thing that gives me some pause in terms of that relief is things like the changes that have been happening at the Pentagon, where he's gone in and decapitated the civilian leadership. I mean, there are people, and probably not the majority of people, but there are people in Washington who are concerned that this may be some sort of soft coup that's taking place. What are your thoughts about that? And if it's not a soft coup, what is he doing?
Well, look, I'm not saying there's nothing to worry about. Those are very troubling personnel moves that he's made. But my confidence level in our ability to prevent a real coup and a real prevention of a transfer of power is just much greater in the aftermath of this election that has now been called by everyone for Joe Biden. It just becomes so very hard for Trump to get away with this. And we all see what he's doing. We all know what he's doing. We're all calling him out for it. And we're doing it from a position of strength, having just defeated him in the polls.
Absolutely. You know, this leads into one of the major topics I wanted to talk about today, which was the state of truth in the country. You know, we live in a world now where if you plug your ears and cover your eyes and just keep repeating yourself, then you can sort of create a factual universe that you can later cite as evidence for whatever other argument you want to make. You know, part of that, I think, and others, including the speaker, thinks that public or social media entities like Facebook have a role to play in rectifying this situation. But you know, what can we do in order to stop what's become a fountain of propaganda and misinformation from sources like social media and certain news outlets? Is there anything that Congress or the Biden administration can do to rectify that?
It's a really important but also a fraught question. How we try to put some sideboards for truth and facts on this out of control thing that is social media and the internet. I'm glad that, you know, Twitter and Facebook are at least beginning to realize they have to say something about this. They have to do some things. I don't know that we can completely leave it to their tender mercies to work this out, because, you know, these are businesses whose success and whose enormous wealth derives from these algorithms that just quickly escalate, you know, the most sensational things at any given time. And that's part of our problem. So I don't have the answer right now. I think Congress is going to have to get engaged. It's been a hands-off thing as the internet has evolved and these platforms have become, you know, so powerful and ubiquitous. I don't know that we will ever want to micromanage them by way of regulation, but the idea of no regulation at all, no accountability at all, that's clearly not working either. And even if you, you know, even if Twitter were to step up and do all the things that would, you know, police these problems, you're going to have some startup like Parler where they don't. And so I think part of the problem we're dealing with is in us. You know, there are still places around this country where, you know, people propagate total lies about faking the moon landing and 9/11 being an inside job, et cetera. And, you know, it's going to be very hard to I don't want us to become Fahrenheit 451, you know, where we're just shutting down all types of speech that bothers us and disturbs us.
Yeah,
So I guess what you're hearing from me is that I haven't figured this thing out yet, but we're going to have to make a better effort than we've done so far to get there.
Yeah. You know, I remember in high school that we had whole sections of our lesson in social studies or history or whatever, where we would talk about propaganda and how that impacted us in the 30s in fascist Europe. And it seems like the cultivating of those kinds of critical thinking skills for students, the younger and better off we'd be if we can sort of install that again. One of the things that's going to be on your plate a little bit moving forward and on the Biden administration's plate is assessing the damage that was done by Trump's orchestrated, and I'm saying this from his own goals, but basically the deconstruction of the administrative state with a lot of the departments that are, you know, in the federal government. What kind of damage do you think you're going to be looking at, and how realistic is it that you're going to be able to fix those problems and then turn around and be an effective policy-making, you know, machine?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, his most flagrant blow at the administrative state, his attempt by executive order to undo the civil service system, that's not going to stick. And, you know, if it's not undone by the courts between now and January, it'll be undone pretty quickly by an executive order that's basically a rewind from President-elect Biden. And look, the reason you do that, of course, we're all sometimes frustrated by the degree of insulation that the civil service system provides to some employees, but there's a reason for that. It's because a century ago, a little over a century ago, there was this spoils system in our federal government where whoever went brought in their relatives and their friends and their political cronies, and government was deeply corrupt, deeply political, and incompetent. And the one who ended that in large part was a Republican by the name of Teddy Roosevelt, who helped to create the modern civil service system. It is a model for the world that has been followed by most other evolved countries in the world. And the idea that we would do away with that and go back to this spoil system, I mean, that's a good fit for Donald Trump's way of operating. He wants only his hand-picked loyalists to have any power anywhere. But it's a terrible, terrible policy that we would very quickly regret. And I'm pretty confident that we're going to be able to turn it around.
My last question, we're almost out of time, but I mean, the real important thing moving forward is this effort at bipartisanship on the part of Joseph Biden in terms of reaching out to the Republicans. Do you think that's going to bear any fruit, or have we moved too far along on this sort of, this never-ending war that we seem to be in?
Well, I think it's never too late because the toxic divisions that we have been living through, they have to stop at some point. Someone has got to be the bigger person, the one who puts country above this absurd tribalism. And I say that as someone that has been in the trenches of this food fight for the last 4 years. And I have, ducked tomatoes and dodged eggs and thrown bananas. I'm in it. I'm as competitive as anyone. I'm really passionate about the things I care about, but I can totally appreciate that this is a moment where all of us have to try to reflect a little and make that effort. I'm not going to change my politics. I'm not going to change the things that I care deeply about and try to make happen. But how I do it and how all of us do it needs to change. It just has to become more conciliatory and more civil. And we have to remember that these tens of millions of people that voted for Donald Trump, despite everything he said and did these last 4 years, that just makes some of us crazy. We can't imagine how so many Americans could still support him. Well, those Americans, we disagree with them, but we've got to disagree while acknowledging that they're not our enemies. They may be our political opponents, and we can continue to have those disagreements, but we're fellow Americans, and we got to reconnect with that sense of constructive friction rather than outright civil war in this country.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you very much for taking the time out to join with us today, Congressman.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. We'll be right back after this short break.
A deeply divided election in a nation on edge. Over this past year, a team of filmmakers have been documenting the hopes and fears of people across a country at odds on everything, from a pandemic to race to politics. A Frontline special presentation, American Voices, a nation in turmoil.
Deputy Public Health Officer Josh Ennis said this week that surging numbers are a major factor in how the state of California determines what closure tier a community belongs in. The state's tier assessments run 2 to 3 weeks behind real-time infections, so next week may well see tighter controls as we risk slipping out of the lowest yellow tier.
So right now across the state, as well as our own county, we're seeing unprecedented growth. The volume is of concern, but even more than that is the acceleration. So how quickly that volume has taken off. Just 2 weeks ago, we had far fewer cases, on the order of very low single digits per day. And now we have days where we're consistently in the double digits. The tier system looks at a couple different things, but one of them that many people can understand is the case rate. So how many new cases per 100,000 people we see every day. The state looks at that every Tuesday, and they're looking at data that's 17 to 10 days old. Okay, so there is a substantial lag in the period of time that they're looking at. And on top of that, they are looking at that data and looking for increases spanning 2 consecutive weeks. So really, movement within the state's tier framework is 2.5, 3 weeks later. So naturally, you can see if we sped up dramatically during that lag period of time, intervention is coming really way too late. So to bring it back home to our own county, the acceleration's been quite dramatic. This prior week, we saw that we stayed within the yellow tier by the skin of our teeth. And come next week, that could look very different when the state looks at our metrics.
Eureka Mayor Susan Seaman this week thanked the candidates who came out to run for a seat on the City Council and congratulated the winners.
I want to take this opportunity to congratulate our 2 incoming City Council members, Katie Moulton from Ward 2 and Scott Bauer from Ward 4. Both candidates will be sworn in during the 2nd meeting in December, and I'm looking forward to serving alongside them in the coming years. I also want to take this opportunity to thank everybody who ran for council this year. It's a big decision to commit to running, and we're lucky in Eureka that we have so much enthusiasm from our constituents who are willing to step up and offer to serve. This was the last election that we run with a traditional majority vote system. Ranked choice voting, or Measure C, passed this year, and that system will be used to select future winners.
That's all the time we have for tonight. A quick look at this week's COVID stats tell the story. Our numbers are growing, and while we're much better off than most, only increased vigilance can keep us from explosive growth in our infection rate. As Deputy Public Health Officer Josh Ennis said this week, it's time to act like everyone you come into contact with is carrying the infection and behave accordingly. So what does that mean? Of course, wear a mask, wash your hands, and keep your distance. As for the rest of us, stay tuned, stay informed.